I mean, I hear conflicting views about this story because apparently the leader of the NFU was in seeing Keir Starmer at some point in the last few days, and apparently, according to some people, he got some concessionary kind of conversations going where he thought that maybe it might, you know, the government might be of a mind to sort of water it down a little bit.
Yeah, I heard something along the similar lines. I think that it's unlikely that we'll see a kind of proper reversal. I do think that when we see the policy come in, often with these big kind of tax changes, often they get announced in a budget and then they go to a bit of a kind of policy process, and eventually when they kind of come out of that kind of meat grinder at the end, they do look slightly different. So whether we'll see a little bit of a concession, I think that the Treasury does not 100% does not want to back down on this, but we could see a little bit of a concession because I think you know, in the end both sides will probably want to see people put the guns down. So I think if they could come to some agreement, we might perhaps see something.
There is this disparity, isn't there, about who's telling the truth about the numbers, and the general consensus seems to be that the numbers that the government are using are probably not quite right, and the farmers, I would say, I trust us slightly more. So maybe if they just switched it slightly and watered it down slightly so that they don't encapsulate all of the actual farmers, if they still want to go after the people who are, you know, using farming as a way of avoiding tax, that's one thing. And maybe they go after them. And I think most people would go, well, all right then, that's probably acceptable. But don't go after the small farmers who are only making 20 grand a year who can't afford it, you know.
No, completely. But I think what's interesting about this policy is that although it's being announced now, actually the effect, we won't see that for a long time. Because if you're a farmer in your 50s, you might think, well, I might not die or might not retire until my 70s or my 80s. So we would only see the policy come into play for a long time. So it's one of those interesting policies where it's a big change now, a big abrupt change that people are seeing. But actually, we won't actually see the effect of it for an awfully long time until basically people, this generation of farmers, you know, dies and has to pass it on to their children. So it's interesting. I think that's partly, I think, why the government were kind of keen to kind of stick on this, because they knew that actually the real backlash would only come perhaps years and years later when we actually start to see the effect of these changes to inheritance tax.
Well, that is the thing, isn't it? I mean, a lot of it's coming in 2027, similarly for ordinary family members as well, who might want to pass on pension schemes and things to their spouses and all of that. It all seems to have been done in a big hurry, and it seems to me that by the time it actually happens, either people will have avoided it anyway, or the government will suddenly go, do you know what, maybe it's not actually worth,
that was the funny thing when you had ministers going out and explaining all the different ways that you could still avoid paying IHT. You know, you could pass that to. It seems strange, you know, that they seem so keen on making sure they got hold of this money from people, but yet they were kind of explaining all the ways that you could still effectively get round it. So it's odd to be pointing out the loopholes in your own tax policy, I suppose.
Yeah, right. I mean, farming was the big story yesterday, I suppose. The big story today appears to be Ed Miliband, who's been running around talking to all sorts of people, not including me, I hasten to add. I don't know why he didn't come in here, but there we are. He's been caught out a little bit on this kind of wind farm revolution that he wants to do, because he keeps continuing to kind of cling on to this idea that we're going to save 300 quid. He should just give it up, because everybody knows it's not true. I'm just going to run through a few clips here of how this all kind of evaluated itself. Here's Keir Starmer back in May of this year promising to bring down bills.
Now, Clean British Power is renewables, which is about a third of the price of fossil fuels at the moment, and that ought to bring down the household bills by about £400 for each bill. But that's a permanent drop. This is the big difference, I think.
It's not a big difference at all, and you're not going to say 400 quid. Let's have Ed Miliband this morning talking about whether it might be 300 quid.
You pledged during the election campaign that every household's energy bill, or the average household energy bill, I should say, would be lower by about £300 by 2030. Is that still happening with all your plans?
This was based on independent modelling, yes, up to £300. That's what we said. And here's the thing: we now have the independent
Ed Miliband, apologies.
System.
Apologies, you said up to £300. That could be a pound. Is it £300 or not?
No, it's not going to be a pound. Look, this was based on independent modelling, which is what we used in the election, that said that bills would be up to £300 lower in a clean power system. And what I was going to say, Naga, this is really, really important, is we now have the National Energy System Operator, the independent body that has looked at these plans and says it's achievable, which is really important. It gives us energy security. It will lower the cost of electricity, and it can lead to lower bills.
So now it can lead to lower bills. Here's what the CEO of the National Energy System Operators says, NESO. Ed Miliband they said that prices will come down.
I think that the NESO report is conclusive proof that Clean Power 2030 will bring down bills.
What we did not set out to do, and what is not our role, is to determine what bills are for consumers. That's a matter of policy.
So basically it's not true that they're going to bring down bills. Bills have gone up. They're going to go up again just before Christmas, and probably yet again in January, probably yet again in April. I mean, can we not get these politicians to stop lying to us?
Yeah, it does. I think that's the big problem that Labour have always had, ever since any government has signed into this pledge of the net zero stuff, is that you can do kind of one or the other. You know, you can basically have energy security, which I think we all agree is a good thing, not being beholden to, you know, Vladimir Putin and kind of global pressures on energy. Or you can try and cut bills in the short term. You can say that in the long term, once you have full energy security, you're not going to be beholden to, you know, these pressures, and actually you can bring bills down. But I think to say that you're going to do both at the same time, I just think is very unlikely to take place. And as we get closer to this 2029, 2030 target, I think it's going to be pretty clear that you're not able to bring bills down at the same time. You know, bills will eventually come down when you have security, but you can't really do both at the same time. And I think, you know, it's very difficult, and it's becoming more and more difficult for Labour to stick to that line. And we're now seeing this kind of gradual watering down of the language, saying up to £300 or could lead to bills coming down, when, you know, I think we all listened to them before the election. In the years before the election, they sounded pretty ironclad about their ability to do so.
Well, I mean, Pat McFadden, I remember appearing on Laura Kunsberg's show, I think the week before the election, and he was sort of forced to back down slightly and say, well, it might not be £300 a year, which is what they originally said. It might be £300 over 5 years. And even that was a very vague promise. And the fact is, you know, it's all very well saying, let's have, energy security, but you can't really make sure that you've got energy security if you start cutting off, you know, your own nose to spite your face. You know, if you decide you're not going to give any more licences out for oil and gas exploration in the North Sea, if you're not going to frack, you know, if you're going to sort of cut off those two areas of energy production, then you can't be in charge of your own energy security simply because of renewables, because it won't work.
Yeah, I think, well, actually, you'd end up being very reliant on having nuclear power as that kind of baseline at the bottom, and then topped up by those renewables. And the fact is that we've been very squeamish about building new nuclear power plants in this country, and where there have been various plans at Sizewell and elsewhere, they've taken, and Hinkley, they've taken absolutely ages to come to fruition. They've ended up being unsurprisingly more expensive than they originally were set out to be, and they're not going to come on stream at the same time. And so we are going to be left with this interesting situation where you're going to have to then rely on strategic gas reserves and kind of long-term storage, which we're not too sure about that's going to work. Like, it's not really there. It's not really, the plans aren't kind of nearly there in place if you're not going to be, you know, if you're not going to kind of grasp the nettle on nuclear to kind of have that as the backup plan when, you know, as people say, when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. No, but that's the trouble, isn't it? Because they do appear to have this kind of net zero obsession. You know, they're all out of COP29. They're all going to go, no doubt, to COP30. There's still going to be conversations around the most important thing, which is the climate in this country. You know, Keir Starmer went off to do deals with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates in the middle of the week in terms of, like, hydrogen hubs that they want to build and all the rest of it. You know, it's kind of ironic that they're going to these big petro states trying to get backing for green energy. Yeah, was it Boris Johnson said we wanted the UK to be the Saudi Arabia of wind? I think he once said. He did say that at one point. I wasn't sure whether he was talking about just the wind that came out of his mouth or whether he was talking about something else. But no, yeah. He's also been very. He was also previously very critical of wind farms. So they couldn't blow the skim off the top of custard, I think, before. So he kind of changed his tune. But yeah, it's interesting that, you know, obviously there was Theresa May's government that signed the net zero pledge into power, and it was Boris Johnson that pushed aggressively to move towards it. And then, you know, Keir Starmer's inherited that, and has obviously, as you say, trying to kind of plot a path to 2030 that's obviously proving more and more difficult as the kind of there's, you know, the different kind of avenues to try and get our kind of wean ourselves off the carbon is proving pretty difficult to do so. Yeah, it is. Just final question for you. Breaking news this morning: UK economy contracted by 0.1% in October. You know, more bad news for Rachel Reeves and her budget, really, isn't it? Yeah, and I think so. And I think actually we talked at the top of this about kind of the farmers, and that was obviously the big story in the days afterwards. I think actually the long-term issue that the government is going to face around the budget is these kind of taxes, higher taxes on business, because that business confidence that is really that what they're going to really rely on to kind of get economic growth and to drive the economy forward. That business confidence has taken a real knocking in the last few months since the budget. So I think that's when they're going to have to really push forward, and if that is going to be the engine of growth going forward, if they're going to see this kind of figures go up, then they're going to have to kind of build back that business confidence, because we know those kind of massive increases to employer national insurance and other taxes have made a real dent.
Yeah, there's nothing good coming down the pike, to be honest, but thank you very much indeed. Alain Tolhurst, Chief Reporter.